Christmas Eve is usually a night wrapped in quiet reverence. Across the world, the Church pauses, lowers her voice, and bends before a mystery too deep for analysis and too vast for argument, God becoming flesh. The eternal stepping into time. The infinite choosing the poverty of a manger. Candles glow softly, bells lose their sharpness, and the faithful gather not to debate or strategize, but to adore. It is a night shaped by stillness, memory, and awe. And yet, on this most sacred of nights, a different kind of voice entered the silence. It did not rise in anger or defiance, but in sorrowful clarity. A voice formed by years of theological reflection, sharpened by history, and animated by love for the Church. On December 24, Cardinal Gerhard Ludwig Müller, former Prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, gave an interview to the Catholic portal cath.net that quietly but powerfully unsettled many within the Catholic world. He did not speak in slogans or polemics. Instead, he offered something more demanding, a diagnosis of a crisis that, in his view, had never truly healed. The heart of his reflection was the liturgy, the Church's living memory and most intimate act of worship. More specifically, he focused on the concrete effects of Traditionis Custodes, judged not by intentions but by consequences. Müller insisted that good intentions, however sincere, do not erase harmful outcomes. And the outcomes, he warned, have carried a real spiritual cost. If you haven't subscribed, click on the subscribe button so you don't miss out on future videos like this, because what you're about to hear is not just news, it's a wake-up call for every heart that still believes truth should burn brighter than silence. Now grab your rosary, quiet your spirit, and let your heart listen, not just with ears, but with faith. He began by naming an assumption that has shaped decades of liturgical decisions, the idea that the Second Vatican Council viewed the traditional Roman liturgy as outdated and destined to be replaced. According to Müller, this assumption is simply false. The Council never declared the ancient liturgy invalid, obsolete, or contrary to the faith. It never demanded a rupture with what generations of Catholics had received as sacred. On the contrary, the Council's documents consistently speak of continuity, organic development, and reform that preserves identity rather than erasing it. The narrative of rupture, Müller argued, did not come from the Council itself, but from ideological interpretations imposed afterward. This distinction matters deeply, because ideas shape policies, and policies shape souls. In the years following the Council, what was meant to be a prudent and gradual reform often became something abrupt and sweeping. Changes were introduced with remarkable speed. Ancient forms disappeared almost overnight. Languages that had carried prayer across centuries were set aside. Ritual gestures rich with meaning were simplified or abandoned. For many of the faithful, this did not feel like organic development. It felt like loss. And worse, it felt unexplained. Müller emphasized that there was a serious lack of theological and pastoral preparation for these changes. People were told what was changing, but not why. They were asked to comply, but not helped to understand. Catechesis failed to keep pace with reform, and pastoral care often did not accompany transformation. The result was not open rebellion, but widespread disorientation. Entire communities arrived at Mass to find the language, rhythm, and atmosphere of their worship transformed, without anyone taking the time to guide them through the meaning behind it all. Faith, Müller reminded listeners, is not sustained by obedience alone. It is sustained by understanding, beauty, and continuity with what came before. When these bonds weaken, fractures appear. Not always loudly, but deeply. Over time, this fracture was intensified by something even more troubling, a gradual erosion of the liturgical sense itself. In many places, though not everywhere, the focus of the liturgy began to drift away from God and toward man. The altar increasingly resembled a stage. The priest appeared more as a performer than a servant. The sacred became familiar, and the mystery manageable. What had once been clearly understood as worship directed heavenward began to resemble a space for personal expression, creativity, and improvisation. But liturgy, Müller implied, is not ours to reinvent at will. It is received before it is shaped, inherited before it is adapted. Its purpose is not to mirror us, but to lift us beyond ourselves. When ritual becomes self-referential, bending inward rather than upward, it loses its essential function. It no longer trains the soul in humility before the holy, and when transcendence fades, confusion inevitably follows. It is within this context that Müller asked people to reconsider a phenomenon often misunderstood, the return of many faithful to the liturgical form codified in the 1962 Missal. This return, he stressed, was not primarily an act of protest or rebellion. It was an act of refuge. For many Catholics, attachment to the traditional liturgy had little to do with nostalgia or ideology. It had everything to do with stability, clarity, and encountering the faith without ambiguity. In a world, and at times in a church, where nearly everything seemed negotiable, the ancient rite felt immovable. It felt like a rock. A place where doctrine was not improvised, where gestures were not optional, where the priest did not invent but obeyed, and where the mystery of God spoke louder than the personality of the minister. For these faithful, the traditional liturgy became a safeguard against arbitrariness and a defense against the constant pressure to adapt the sacred to the spirit of the age. It was not an escape from the present, but a defense of Catholic continuity. This, Müller suggested, explains why the implementation of Traditionis Custodes struck so deeply. Rather than addressing the underlying causes of the crisis, such as liturgical confusion, theological thinness, and loss of reverence, the document attempted to impose unity through restriction, uniformity through discipline, order through prohibition. Müller did not deny papal authority. He explicitly affirmed that the Pope's authority over liturgical matters is real, legitimate, and essential to the Church's unity. But he also warned that authority is not self-justifying. It must be exercised in harmony with truth, and truth is not created by decree. Tradition, Müller insisted, is not an obstacle to be managed or removed. It is the Church's living memory, the accumulated wisdom of centuries of prayer, sacrifice, and belief. When authority detaches itself from this memory, governance risks becoming functional and managerial, more concerned with efficiency and control than with the salvation of souls. This, he argued, is not merely a bureaucratic problem. It is a spiritual one. As the Church proclaimed on Christmas Eve that the Word became flesh, Müller dared to suggest that something essential had been forgotten, that faith cannot survive without roots, that worship cannot endure without reverence, and that unity cannot be built by suppressing legitimate differences grounded in the same faith. His words did not accuse. They mourned. And as midnight mass faded into the cold winter air, a haunting question remained: if the liturgy is no longer allowed to speak with the full voice of the Church's memory, what will shape the faith of the next generation? The silence following Müller's intervention was heavy, not empty. It was the kind of silence that settles after something serious has been placed before the conscience. And his reflection did not stop with liturgical rules. It moved into a deeper tension that has marked the Church in every age, the relationship between authority and truth. The real crisis, Müller suggested, is not simply which missal is permitted. It is what happens when authority acts as though tradition itself were suspect. For Müller, this reflects a misunderstanding of tradition. Tradition is not a museum relic, not nostalgia, not a political banner. It is the living transmission of truth, faithfully received and handed on. To sever authority from this transmission is to hollow authority out from within. Müller was careful to clarify that he was not questioning the Pope's legal competence or role as guarantor of unity. What he questioned was the logic behind certain applications of that authority. Unity, he reminded listeners, is not achieved by suppressing difference, but by sharing the same faith. The Church has never been uniform in expression. Across centuries, different rites, languages, and spiritual sensibilities coexisted, not as a weakness, but as evidence of a faith strong enough to take root in diverse cultures. Demanding external uniformity without addressing internal belief risks confusing obedience with communion, and communion cannot be coerced. Müller warned that when governance loses theological depth, it risks becoming mere management. Decisions are then driven by efficiency, optics, or control rather than by the slow and demanding work of forming consciences. In such a climate, the liturgy becomes a problem to be solved instead of a mystery to be revered, and that subtle shift changes everything. His critique widened further to the broader cultural context. Müller spoke of a world increasingly shaped by reductive worldviews that strip the human person of transcendence and reduce life to what can be measured, optimized, or administered. When the Church unconsciously adopts these categories, she risks mirroring the world rather than converting it. Abstract theories about identity and freedom promise liberation but often produce fragmentation, confusion, and division. Within this framework, even legitimate human dimensions such as emotions and desires can become destructive when detached from authentic love and responsibility. Müller insisted that this is not moralism, but realism. Christian realism acknowledges the dignity of the human person while refusing to deny the consequences of disorder. What is not ordered toward the good ultimately turns against the person. This brought Müller to the role of bishops. A bishop, he said, is not a manager or trend follower, but a successor of the apostles. His primary responsibility is theological discernment, knowing what he believes, understanding what the Church teaches, and recognizing what strengthens or weakens faith. Without this discernment, the Church risks becoming an institution that manages processes without transmitting truth. Structures multiply, committees expand, documents proliferate, but souls quietly drift away. Müller connected the present crisis to decades of pastoral strategies that favored adaptation over testimony. The results are visible: empty churches, declining vocations, and weakened faith. Structural reforms without spiritual depth exhaust the Church. Assemblies without missionary fire fail to inspire. Committees without faith cannot replace saints. Most tragic of all is the silent departure of those who do not protest but simply leave because they no longer recognize the Church's voice. Müller's words were not a call to rebellion, but to remembrance. A reminder that unity without truth is fragile, authority without tradition brittle, and reform without continuity destructive. As rumors grow that the January consistory may finally address the liturgical question as a central issue, expectations rise. Such a move would be risky, disruptive, and demanding, but it might also be healing. Healing begins when wounds are named, when questions are faced, and when authority listens as well as governs. The Church now stands at a moment of quiet urgency. The question before her is not merely about liturgical forms, but about identity, faith, and fidelity. Is this the hour to rediscover the heart of Catholic worship, or will the silence deepen? If this message touched your heart, like this video and share your thoughts in the comment or comment Amen and stay with us. More Eucharistic stories, deeper reflections, and holy insights are on the way. May Christ in the Eucharist be your light, your rest, your truth. Amen.